The deeper diplomats dig into the Ukraine file, the clearer one thing becomes. The distance between Kiev and Moscow isn't about clever wording or smart sequencing. It's about two totally different visions of the future. Ukraine's leaders say any deal has to restore their full sovereignty, protect their people, and make sure Russia pays a heavy price if it ever tries this again. Russia's leader is still trying to redraw the map and rewrite the history books at the same time. That's the canyon every new peace push, including Trump's, pretends it can somehow jump over. For Vladimir Putin, this war has never been just about Donetsk or a few lines on a military map. It's about dragging Ukraine back into Russia's orbit and proving that Western security guarantees don't mean much when the shooting starts. That's why the demands from Moscow aren't only about land. They include long-term limits on Ukraine's army, its defense industry, and its foreign policy. A Ukraine that can freely choose its allies, rebuild a modern military, and plug itself into Western economies is a direct threat to the imperial project Putin has been building for nearly a quarter of a century. For Ukraine, those demands are life or death. Any deal that locks in Russia's control over occupied areas tells millions of Ukrainians on both sides of the front line that their futures can be traded away without their say. Caps on the size of the army, or limits on joining alliances, don't look like technical fine print from Kiev's point of view. They look like second-class statehood. Ukrainians remember what happened after the Budapest Memorandum in the 1990s, when they gave up the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal for assurances that Russia later tore up. New promises that look similar, only weaker, are a very hard sell. That's why every attempt to run dual tracks keeps falling apart. One set of talks with Kiev, another with Moscow, and then an effort to splice the results together sounds good in theory. Negotiators can push each side to accept flexible language, creative ambiguity, and phased steps. But once those formulas land on the desks of presidents who live in totally different realities, they hit a wall. Putin wants recognition of gains he hasn't fully secured. Zelensky has to protect people who are still under daily shelling. For one, concessions mean banking a victory. For the other, they look like the beginning of a much bigger disaster. The deep lack of trust makes this structural clash even more toxic. Since 2014, Ukrainians have watched Russia violate ceasefires, use quiet periods to rearm, and turn negotiations into cover for covert operations. The Minsk agreements were marketed as a pathway to a political solution in the Donbas. In practice, they froze a conflict that Moscow later blew wide open with a full-scale invasion. Today, many in Kyiv see any Russian outreach through that lens. At best, a tactical pause, at worst, a trap. Under those conditions, even the most carefully drafted agreement feels fragile and temporary. Trump's team argues they can break this deadlock with a different kind of pressure. His envoys float the idea that by offering sanctions relief, reconstruction money, and some route back into elite Western forums, they can tempt the Kremlin to scale back its goals. Maybe they suggest Russia can be nudged into settling for less than its loudest, most extreme demands. But the signals from Moscow don't really back that up. Officials keep repeating that so-called new realities on the ground have to be accepted. A polite way of saying Ukraine should live with territorial losses. Ukrainians hear that as capitulation dressed up as realism. None of this means diplomacy is useless. It does mean the outline of any serious agreement won't come out of photo ops, handshake moments, or made-up deadlines. It will be shaped by the balance of power on the battlefield. So when Trump or other outsiders say both sides need to compromise, they skip over the most basic fact. Only one side invaded. Only one side is trying to erase the other as a political and cultural nation. Seen from that angle, the supposed choice between a bad deal and no deal is anything but even. For Moscow, even a partial freeze, where it keeps what it's grabbed, can be spun as a win and used as time to rebuild. For Kiev, a bad deal might actually be worse than no deal at all, locking in Russian control while leaving Ukraine weaker and more exposed. But walking away from that kind of deal means betting the country can survive years more of war without snapping. That's part of the tragedy of Zelensky's situation. He has to balance not only what's morally right, but what's physically survivable. Around that core dispute, a whole cloud of technical-sounding ideas has formed. Draft texts circulating in foreign capitals talk about limits on the size of Ukraine's armed forces, phased troop pullbacks, demilitarized zones, and all kinds of economic incentives. Numbers like a 600,000 strong army or specific artillery ratios can sound precise and reassuring. In reality, they're just placeholders. They only work if Russia sticks to the broader political deal. If Moscow decides to rearm and launch another offensive, those limits stop being safeguards and turn into weaknesses. The same fuzziness hangs over debates about Ukraine's future alliances. Some Western officials quietly hint that full NATO membership, once Kiev's big strategic goal, might have to give way to softer security guarantees. One-on-one defense pacts, long-term arms deliveries, or joint pledges by major powers to respond quickly if Russia attacks again. On paper, that sounds flexible and innovative. On the ground, Ukrainians have heard versions of this before. They know political moods in Washington, Berlin, or Paris can swing faster than you can train and equip a brigade. A promise on paper for 5 or 10 years from now is thin comfort when cruise missiles are hitting apartment blocks today. Money is another big piece of these conceptual deals. Supporters talk about a massive reconstruction fund for Ukraine, pulling in Western, Gulf, and maybe even carefully managed Russian assets to rebuild highways, power grids, schools, and homes. They suggest Russia could be rewarded over time with targeted sanctions relief or a path back into high-level international clubs, if it behaves. But anyone who's watched how murky, oligarch-dominated economies like Russia's and Ukraine's really operate knows how easily such plans can be captured, delayed, or stripped down. Funding may arrive late, in smaller amounts, and often not where it's most desperately needed. Whether Russia should ever be welcomed back into elite groups like the G8 shows the deeper anxiety behind all this. Letting Putin sit again at a table with leaders of major democracies would send a blunt signal: invade a neighbor, annex territory, commit documented atrocities, and eventually it might all be forgiven for the sake of stability. That's a tough sell for European publics, especially in countries that have taken in millions of Ukrainian refugees and paid for weapons with their own tax money. For people living under occupation, under censorship, torture threats, and forced Russification, the idea their abusers shaking hands at luxury summits is almost unbearable. All these uncertainties pull us back to the one test that really matters. Does any potential deal actually stop the war, or does it just hit pause under terms that favor the aggressor? That's the brutal math Zelensky has to do. Signing a deal that officially gives up Donetsk and other occupied territories might reduce shelling in the short term and let some displaced families rebuild lives somewhere else in Ukraine. But it would also send a loud, dangerous message. Mass violence works. In the long run, that lesson doesn't prevent war. It invites more of it, from Russia or from other players watching this conflict closely. At home, the political cost of making that kind of concession would be huge. Since the full-scale invasion, Ukraine's political class has held together in a way that would have seemed impossible before 2022. Parties and leaders who once fought bitterly now broadly back the war effort. That unity is built on the belief that the state is doing everything it can to defend its land and people. A deal that looks like trading territory for vague promises risks blowing that unity apart overnight. Veterans, families of the dead, frontline communities, and millions who fled Russian occupation would feel stabbed in the back. The government might not fall the next day, but its authority would be deeply shaken. At the same time, the case for fighting on indefinitely is getting harder to defend. Ukraine is facing a serious manpower crunch as casualties rise and fewer people are willing or able to go to the front. New mobilization laws are politically explosive. Every fresh wave of call-ups hits households that have already given sons, brothers, or fathers to the army. Western partners argue among themselves over more long-range missiles or advanced air defenses, and even when they agree, deliveries often arrive months later than Ukrainian commanders had hoped. You can see the pressure in exhausted units, overstretched logistics, and a home front that is proud but increasingly worn down. Layered on top of that is the corrosive impact of corruption scandals and political rivalry. Investigations into senior officials, including people close to Zelensky, flare up from time to time, fueling claims that some in power are misusing Western aid or using wartime conditions for personal gain. Anti-corruption activists say these probes prove Ukraine is trying to clean up its system even during war. Russian propagandists say they prove Ukraine hasn't changed at all. For Zelensky, every such scandal is a reminder that his moral capital abroad depends on showing his country is genuinely different from the corrupt authoritarian regime it's fighting. Meanwhile, the front line is constantly shifting. Russian troops keep testing for weak spots, pushing harder in some sectors while tightening their grip in others. Areas in Zaporizhia, the routes toward Pokrovsk and Donetsk, and the Kupiansk direction in the northeast have all come under heavier pressure. Strategic cities like Kramatorsk, still in Ukrainian hands, are hit again and again by drones and missiles. The neat image of a frozen conflict with clean, static lines and stable rules doesn't match the reality on the ground. Any deal that pretends otherwise will be exposed very quickly and brutally. Faced with all of this, Ukraine and its partners have, consciously or not, fallen back on a long-term strategy. Outlast Russia. The ideas that sustained battlefield losses, a drained workforce, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation will slowly weaken Putin's system until it can't keep up this level of aggression. In that scenario, some future Russian leadership, whether after Putin or under a more pragmatic version of him, might accept a more balanced settlement, pull back its troops, and normalize relations. By saying no deal right now, Zelensky is partly betting that this future moment arrives before his own state reaches its breaking point. But betting on the collapse of an authoritarian regime is always risky. Systems like Putin's have fewer checks, less transparency, and more tools of repression than democracies. They can push their populations further before real cracks show up. Even shocking events, like the Wagner Group's brief rebellion in 2023, are hard to read. For a couple of days, armed mercenaries were literally driving toward Moscow. Then the uprising just stopped, swallowed up in secret negotiations. Was that a sign of deep weakness or ruthless flexibility? Analysts are still arguing about it. Ukraine is the opposite, an open, noisy democracy. Its problems, corruption, mobilization fights, budget gaps, military setbacks, are debated in parliament, investigated by the press, and argued over in public. That openness is a strength. But it also means Ukraine's difficulties are easier to see, measure, and twist in foreign political arguments. When skeptical lawmakers in the US or Europe question more aid, they quote very real numbers: deficits, casualty estimates, stalled advances. Stalled advances. Supporters of Ukraine point to the same reality to make the opposite case. A smaller country holding off a much larger invader with everything on the line. This imbalance feeds the story that some kind of territorial compromise might be the responsible way out. Early in the war, the idea that Ukraine should officially give up land for peace was widely slammed in Western policy circles as rewarding aggression. As time went on, pieces of that argument started showing up in think tank reports, op-eds, and private conversations. Trump's 28-point peace outline, with its hints at forced territorial adjustments and ceasefire lines, didn't invent this thinking, but it did turn a vague temptation into a concrete talking point. European diplomats have tried to counter that by drafting their own plans that restate Ukraine's full territorial integrity and avoid direct land swaps. But even when those documents skip explicit concessions, Moscow's message stays the same. Putin keeps insisting that areas his forces occupy, or claim to have annexed, are forever part of Russia. In practice, he's asking the world to accept outcomes that break the UN Charter in exchange for nothing more solid than a promise to shoot less. For Zelensky, buying into that logic wouldn't just redraw borders on a map, it would redraw the moral foundations Ukraine stands on. As Trump sends his special envoy back to Moscow yet again, the script looks sadly familiar. The envoy will almost certainly hear the same hardened demands from Russian officials. Donetsk must be surrendered. Kiev must accept limits. The West must ease sanctions. That message will then travel back to Trump's camp, where it may be reframed as proof that Ukraine is the problem if it refuses to sign. From there, the pressure moves towards Zelensky through speeches, TV commentary, and private warnings that Western aid can't run forever if he won't compromise. In this kind of cycle, Dates like the abandoned Thanksgiving deadline matter less than the storyline they feed. Each artificial cutoff becomes another moment where Zelensky is asked to pick how he wants to be portrayed, as pragmatic or stubborn, as saving lives now, or clinging to principles. That framing is tempting for audiences far from the front. Who can debate trade-offs in the abstract? For Ukrainians living under occupation or under constant fire, the choice is anything but abstract. Accepting a bad deal means leaving neighbors, friends, and relatives under the rule of an army that has already shown exactly how it operates. Zelensky's task is to handle this outside pressure without losing his base at home. He has to persuade Ukrainians that any compromise he even considers is aimed at long-term survival, not at quick relief or to please foreign politicians. At the same time, he needs to hold on to enough backing in Washington and European capitals so that if he does reject a deal, Ukraine isn't left to fight alone. Those goals can easily pull in opposite directions. The tougher and more defiant he sounds, the more some foreign supporters may complain. The more flexible he sounds, the more nervous his own people become. Right now, there's no real balance in sight. Russia keeps firing missiles, rotating troops, and squeezing Ukraine's economy wherever it can. Ukraine keeps digging trenches, calling up more soldiers, and trying to keep the power on. Western governments juggle Ukraine alongside crises in the Middle East, rising tensions in Asia, and bitter domestic politics. Into that chaos, Trump has dropped a promise of quick peace that risks oversimplifying a conflict built out of decades of history, trauma, and strategic rivalry. If his initiative ends with an offer Zelensky can't accept, the easy narrative will be that peace was within reach and then lost. In truth, the decision facing Ukraine's president isn't between peace and war, it's between different kinds of danger. A bad deal risks hollowing out his country from the inside and inviting more aggression later. No deal means living with open war and the hope that time, resilience, and sustained international support will eventually tilt the odds. With every month of failed diplomacy, shifting deadlines, and half-baked plans, that awful choice moves closer to center stage. Zelensky can't step around it. All he can do is try to make sure that, when the moment finally comes, Ukraine is still strong enough to choose its own fate.